I was the only person standing beside my grandfather's coffin. The funeral home in Norfolk, Virginia was so quiet I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioner above the ceiling tiles. Rows of wooden chairs stretched behind me, almost all of them empty. A few pale flowers rested near the casket, their scent faint in the still air. The funeral director kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to arrive at the last minute. No one did. Not my father. Not my mother. Not my younger brother. The Carter family name appeared neatly printed on the funeral program, but none of them had come to say goodbye. I had known for weeks when the service would take place. So had they. The message my parents sent that morning still glowed in my memory like a bruise. Handle it yourself. We have meetings. I remember sitting in my car outside the funeral home before walking inside, staring at those words on my phone screen and wondering how things had come to this. The man lying in that casket had once carried responsibilities most people could never imagine. He had spent years protecting people who would never even know his name. Yet when the time came for someone to stand beside him at the end of his life, the only person left was me. I folded the funeral program slowly in my hands and tried to focus on the minister's voice as he began the service. The room was small, built for maybe 40 people, though fewer than 10 chairs were occupied. 2 elderly neighbors from my grandfather's street had come. I recognized them from the few times I visited him over the years. They sat quietly near the back, hands folded in their laps, their expressions kind but distant. The rest of the chairs remained empty. The minister spoke gently about service, loyalty, and the quiet dignity of a life lived without seeking attention. His words floated through the room like echoes, touching something deep inside me. Walter James Carter. That was the name engraved on the brass plate of the coffin. United States Navy. Just 2 simple lines in the printed program described his life. No mention of the years he spent in uniform. No mention of the stories he never told. For most of my life, my grandfather had been a quiet man who lived alone in a small house near the Virginia coast. He spent his mornings drinking coffee on the porch and watching fishing boats move across the harbor. He never bragged about anything. In fact, he barely talked about the past at all. When I was younger, I sometimes wondered if he had lived a boring life. The rest of my family certainly acted like he had. My parents, Richard and Linda Carter, ran a successful transportation company in Raleigh, North Carolina. Their lives revolved around contracts, clients, and reputation. They liked things organized and predictable. My grandfather was neither. After my grandmother passed away several years earlier, the distance between him and my parents slowly grew. At first it was small things, missed visits, canceled holidays, phone calls that became shorter each year. Then the invitations stopped altogether. Eventually, it became normal for my family to act as if he simply didn't exist. The funeral director cleared his throat softly beside me. "Would you like to wait a few more minutes before we continue?" he asked in a careful voice. He glanced again at the door. I followed his gaze. The hallway outside remained empty. I shook my head. "They're not coming." The service continued, brief and respectful. The minister said a final prayer, and the room fell silent except for the faint rustle of coats and shifting chairs. When it was over, the 2 neighbors approached the coffin first. They placed their hands on the polished wood for a moment before stepping away. One of them squeezed my shoulder gently as she passed. "I'm sorry for your loss," she whispered. I thanked her, though the words felt strangely hollow. Loss was only part of what I felt. Standing there alone, I also felt anger, because no matter what my parents believed about my grandfather, he deserved more than an empty room. When the neighbors left, the funeral home grew quiet again. I stepped closer to the coffin and rested my hand lightly on the polished surface. "Goodbye." "Grandpa," I said under my breath. For a moment I simply stood there, remembering the long drives I used to make from North Carolina to visit him, the quiet afternoons on his porch, the way he would listen more than he spoke. Then the front door of the funeral home opened with a soft creak. I turned. An older man stepped inside. He wore a worn navy jacket and moved slowly, like someone carrying old injuries. His hair was gray, his posture straight despite the years. He didn't say a word. He walked past the rows of empty chairs and stopped beside the coffin. For several seconds he stood there in silence. Then he raised his hand in a sharp, perfect salute. The kind of salute you see in military ceremonies. His expression never changed. After a moment he lowered his hand, nodded once toward the coffin, and walked back toward the door. I opened my mouth to ask who he was. But before I could speak, he was gone. The funeral director returned carrying a small cardboard box. "These were your grandfather's personal belongings," he said gently. I took the box and looked inside. A folded piece of paper, a few old photographs, and resting on top of everything else, a heavy metal medal I had seen once before, years ago, inside a wooden box in my grandfather's living room. At that moment, it looked like nothing more than an old piece of metal. I had no idea that this small object was about to reveal a secret my entire family had never understood. I sat in my car outside the funeral home long after the service had ended. The engine was off, and the quiet of the parking lot felt heavier than the silence inside the chapel had been. Rain clouds drifted slowly across the gray Virginia sky, and the cardboard box with my grandfather's belongings rested on the passenger seat beside me. I kept looking at it, not opening it again, just staring at it like it might somehow explain everything that had happened over the years. The truth was, my grandfather hadn't always been a ghost in our family. There was a time when he had been part of everything. Growing up, my parents spoke about him the same way most families talked about grandparents. He came to birthday dinners. He showed up for Christmas mornings. When I was little, he used to lift me onto his shoulders so I could hang ornaments on the top of the tree. Back then, he was simply Grandpa, Walter Carter. But somewhere along the way, things changed. My parents ran a transportation company in Raleigh, North Carolina. It started small, just a few trucks and local contracts. But over time, it grew into something much larger. As the business expanded, their lives became more structured, more focused on reputation and control. They liked order. They liked predictability. And my grandfather didn't fit into that world anymore. The shift started after my grandmother died. Her name was Eleanor Carter, and she had always been the bridge between my father and my grandfather. When she was alive, family dinners were still warm, still full of conversation. She had a way of smoothing over arguments before they could grow into something worse. When she passed away, that balance disappeared. At first, the distance between my parents and my grandfather was subtle. They visited him less often. Phone calls became shorter. Holiday invitations turned into polite suggestions that never quite became plans. I remember the first Thanksgiving when he wasn't there. We were sitting around the long dining table in my parents' house. The turkey was already carved, the television murmuring quietly in the background. My younger brother kept glancing toward the empty chair at the end of the table. "Is Grandpa coming later?" he asked. My father didn't even look up from his plate. "He prefers being on his own these days," he said casually. Something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. That night, after dinner, I walked into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. My parents were standing near the sink, speaking quietly. My mother's voice was low but clear enough for me to hear. "He's becoming a problem," she said. I froze in the hallway. My father didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice sounded tired. "We'll deal with it." I never asked them what they meant. But that sentence stayed with me. A few months later, I witnessed the argument that changed everything. It happened at my grandfather's house near the Virginia coast. I had driven up to visit him, and my father happened to arrive the same afternoon. At first, the conversation was normal, small talk about work, about the weather, about repairs needed on the old house. Then the tone shifted. My father started talking about responsibility, about how my grandfather should accept help from the family. My grandfather sat quietly in his chair, listening without interrupting. Finally, he spoke. "I never asked for anything from you," he said calmly. My father's jaw tightened. "That's not the point," he replied. "The point is that we can't keep cleaning up your problems." I remember looking at my grandfather, confused. I had no idea what problems my father was talking about. Grandpa didn't raise his voice. He simply leaned back in his chair and looked out the window for a moment before answering. "You don't need to come back here," he said quietly. The room fell silent. My father stood up so quickly his chair scraped against the floor. "Fine," he said. And that was the end of it. After that day, my parents stopped visiting him altogether. At first they said it was temporary. Work schedules were busy. Travel was complicated. There were always reasons. But weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Eventually, my grandfather's name stopped appearing in conversations entirely. During Christmas dinners, his place at the table disappeared. In family photographs, there was simply one less person. One evening, I asked my mother why we never talked about him anymore. She didn't look angry. She just looked distant. "Some people make their own choices," she said. But something about the way she said it never felt right. Because while the rest of my family created distance, I kept visiting him. The drive from Raleigh to Norfolk took about 4 hours. I made the trip whenever I could, sometimes once a month. Sometimes less depending on work. Each time I arrived, I would find him exactly the same. Sitting on the porch, watching the water, drinking coffee from the same old mug. He never asked why my parents stopped coming. And he never complained about it either. In fact, he almost never mentioned them at all. We talked about small things instead. Fishing boats passing through the harbor. Old movies he liked to watch late at night. The weather. Sometimes neighbors would stop by to greet him. A few of them always thanked him for his service, though he brushed those comments away like they meant nothing. Inside the house, there was one object I had noticed since childhood. A small wooden box on a shelf in the living room. He kept it closed at all times. One afternoon years earlier, curiosity finally got the better of me. "What's in the box?" I asked. He looked at it for a moment before answering. "Just something from a long time ago." He didn't say anything else. Back in the present. I finally opened the cardboard box on the passenger seat. Inside were a few photographs and a folded sheet of paper. And resting on top of everything else was the same metal I had once glimpsed inside that wooden box. I lifted it carefully. For the first time, I turned it slowly in the light. Along the edge of the metal was an engraving, small symbols, and a set of letters I didn't recognize. At the time, I thought it was just another mystery my grandfather had taken with him to the grave. The highway stretched endlessly in front of me as I drove south toward North Carolina. The funeral was behind me. But my thoughts kept circling back to my grandfather's house near the water outside Norfolk. Every mile down the road seemed to pull another memory out of the past. Memories that suddenly felt different now that he was gone. The cardboard box with his belongings sat on the passenger seat. Every time sunlight passed through the windshield, the metal inside it caught the light for just a second. I tried not to look at it, but it kept pulling my attention back. Because the truth was, the last few visits I had with my grandfather had never felt ordinary. At the time, I didn't realize it. Looking back now, I think he may have been trying to prepare me for something. His house sat at the end of a quiet road not far from the harbor. It was small and simple. The kind of place people built decades ago before anyone worried about property values or modern design. A narrow porch wrapped around the front, and a faded American flag hung beside the door. When the wind came in from the water, the flag would ripple softly against the wooden railing. That house always smelled faintly of coffee and sea air. My grandfather lived alone there for years after my grandmother died. The place wasn't fancy, but it was always neat. Every tool in his garage had its own place. Every book on the shelf stood perfectly upright. His routines rarely changed. Morning coffee on the porch. Afternoons spent fixing small things around the house. Evenings listening to old radio stations while the sun disappeared behind the water. If you didn't know him well, you might assume he lived an uneventful life. But sometimes small things made me wonder. Once or twice during my visits, I noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked further down the road. Black SUVs that didn't belong to any of the neighbors. Another time, 2 men wearing military uniforms stopped by the house. They didn't stay long. My grandfather spoke with them outside on the porch while I waited inside. I could see their silhouettes through the screen door, standing straight and still. When they left, one of them shook my grandfather's hand in a way that looked more formal than friendly. "Old friends?" I asked when he came back inside. He nodded once. "Something like that." He didn't elaborate. At the time, I didn't think much about it. Now it feels different. Another memory came to me as the road stretched further south. One afternoon, I had been helping him organize a closet in the hallway. Several small boxes were stacked on the floor, and while moving them, I accidentally knocked one over. A folder slipped out and fell open on the carpet. Photographs spilled across the floor. Black and white pictures of young men standing beside military helicopters. Their uniforms were unmistakable. Navy SEAL insignia stitched onto their shoulders. For a moment, I just stared at the photographs, because one of those men was my grandfather. He looked completely different from the quiet old man I knew. Younger, stronger, standing confidently among the other soldiers. When he saw what I was looking at, he stepped forward and gathered the photographs quickly. His expression wasn't angry, just thoughtful. "That was another life," he said. Then he placed the photos back inside the folder and closed the closet. Later that evening, we sat on the porch watching the sun dip toward the horizon. The water turned orange under the fading light, and the air smelled like salt and damp wood. I finally asked the question that had been on my mind all day. "Were you a Navy SEAL?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and watched a fishing boat moving slowly across the harbor. After a while, he asked me something unexpected. "Do you think people should be remembered for the loudest thing they did?" he said. "Or the quietest?" I didn't know what to say. He gave a faint smile. "Some things we survive," he added quietly. "Not everyone else does." There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not sadness exactly. More like the weight of memories he had carried alone for a long time. A week before he died, I made one last visit. The weather had turned colder by then. Wind from the water rattled the porch railing as we sat outside drinking coffee. He looked older than usual that day. His hands trembled slightly when he lifted his mug, but his mind was still sharp. He asked about my work, about my life, about whether I was happy. Then he said something that confused me at the time. "If anyone ever asks about me," he said slowly, "you don't owe them answers." I assumed he meant my parents. Now I'm not so sure. Before I left that evening, he placed a familiar wooden box on the table between us. The same box I had seen sitting on the shelf in his living room for years. For a moment, I thought he might finally open it. His hand rested on the lid for several seconds. Then he slid the box back toward the wall. "Drive safe," he said instead. That was the last time I saw him alive. A week later, one of his neighbors called me. My grandfather had passed away quietly in his house. No dramatic final words. No explanations. Just silence. Back on the highway, I finally pulled into a rest area and turned off the engine. The parking lot was almost empty. I opened the cardboard box again and lifted the metal out carefully. It felt heavier than it looked. Turning it slowly in the sunlight, I studied the engraving along its edge. There were small symbols etched into the metal, and beside them, a series of letters and numbers. At the time, they meant nothing to me. Years later, I would realize those markings belonged to a specific military unit, a code that would make a Navy general freeze the moment he saw it. My phone rang somewhere outside Richmond. I had been driving for hours, the highway stretching endlessly in front of me, when the name on the screen made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. "Dad." For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something told me this call wasn't going away. I tapped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. "Hello?" My father's voice came through immediately, direct and businesslike. How did the funeral go? The question sounded almost like a formality, something said out of obligation rather than concern. "It's over," I said. There was a short pause. Then he asked his next question. "What's happening with the house?" I blinked. Confused? "The house. Your grandfather's place in Virginia," he said. "We need to figure out what to do with it." The words hit me harder than I expected. My grandfather had been buried less than 2 hours earlier. Yet somehow the conversation had already turned to property. My mother's voice suddenly joined the call through the speaker. "We've been looking at the market in that area," she said. "Waterfront property has gone up quite a bit in value. It would make sense to sell quickly before maintenance becomes a problem." I gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Did either of you even think about coming today?" I asked. The silence on the line lasted just long enough to feel uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat. "We talked about this already. Your grandfather preferred to live his own way." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. My mother spoke again, her tone calm and measured. "Emily, we're trying to handle things responsibly." Responsibly. The word echoed in my head. The funeral chapel with rows of empty chairs flashed through my memory. Responsibly would have been showing up, I said. Neither of them answered. Instead, my father changed the subject. "There may also be paperwork we need to locate," he said. "Bank records. Military documents. Anything that could complicate things." "Complicate what?" "The company," he said. That caught my attention. "What does Grandpa have to do with your company?" My parents ran Carter Logistics, a transportation business that had grown steadily over the past 20 years. Their reputation in Raleigh meant everything to them. My father hesitated before answering. "Your grandfather had a complicated past," he said. I frowned. "What does that mean?" My mother spoke before he could respond. "Walter didn't always make the best decisions," she said carefully. "There were things that made the family uncomfortable." "Like what?" Another pause. Then my father said something that sounded rehearsed. "He refused help when he needed it. He isolated himself. Sometimes that kind of behavior reflects poorly on the people around you." I stared out the windshield at the road ahead. For years, they had used vague explanations like this whenever my grandfather came up. But now, hearing it again right after the funeral, it sounded even thinner. "You mean the man who lived alone for 10 years because nobody visited him?" I said quietly. My father sighed. "Emily, you're oversimplifying things." "No, I'm remembering them." The car fell silent except for the sound of tires against pavement. Finally, my mother spoke again. "Did he leave anything behind?" I glanced at the cardboard box on the passenger seat. "What do you mean?" "Documents," she said. "Valuable items. Anything related to his time in the military." The question made my stomach tighten. For a moment, I considered telling them about the medal. Instead, I said the first thing that came to mind. "Just a few personal belongings. Nothing significant." My father asked. "No." My mother sounded disappointed. "That's surprising," she said. "Men like him usually keep records." "Men like him." The phrase felt strange. "What kind of records?" I asked. But she had already moved on. "We'll need to arrange for the house to be cleaned out," she said. "There could be maintenance issues if it sits empty too long." I felt a slow wave of anger rising in my chest. "You didn't even attend his funeral," I said. My father's voice hardened slightly. "He chose his life." "That's not what happened." "Emily," he said sharply, "you were a child when things changed. You don't know the whole story." Maybe that was true. But I remembered enough. I remembered the argument in my grandfather's living room. I remembered my father walking out the door. I remembered the years of silence that followed. And I remembered standing alone beside a coffin while the rest of my family stayed home. "I know enough," I said. The conversation ended shortly after that. My parents said we would talk again soon about the house. Then the line went dead. For several minutes I drove without speaking, the empty highway stretching endlessly ahead. Eventually I pulled into a small rest stop beside the road. The parking lot was quiet, surrounded by trees that swayed gently in the afternoon wind. I reached for the cardboard box and opened it again. The metal rested inside, dull metal catching the light. I picked it up and turned it slowly between my fingers. The engraving along the edge looked clearer in the sunlight. Tiny symbols, and a series of letters and numbers. I didn't understand what they meant, but something about them made me uneasy. For the first time, I felt certain about one thing. Whatever story my parents believed about my grandfather, they had never known the whole truth. Several years passed before I thought about the metal again. Life moved forward the way it usually does after loss. Work became busy. Routines settled in. And the sharp edge of grief slowly dulled into something quieter. I moved to Charleston for a teaching job and eventually married Daniel Brooks, a military lawyer who worked with the Navy's legal branch. Our life together was steady and comfortable, but the metal never left my possession. For a long time it stayed in the back of a drawer beside my bed. Sometimes months passed without me touching it. Other times I would take it out late at night and turn it slowly under the light, tracing the unfamiliar symbols along its edge. I still didn't know what they meant. And strangely, I never tried to find out. Maybe part of me believed that whatever answers the metal held belonged to my grandfather alone. One evening, Daniel walked into the kitchen holding a stack of paperwork from his office. "There's a ceremony next month at the Norfolk Naval Base," he said while setting the papers on the counter. "They're honoring several retired service members and special operations units. I have to attend for work." I nodded absent-mindedly while rinsing dishes in the sink. "That sounds nice." He leaned against the counter. "You should come with me." I looked up. "To a Navy ceremony." "Why not?" he said. "Your grandfather served in the Navy. It might mean something to you." For a moment I didn't answer. I hadn't been back to Norfolk since the funeral. The thought of returning stirred memories I had carefully avoided for years. Then I thought about the medal sitting in my drawer. "All right," I said. The naval base was larger than I remembered. When we arrived that evening, the setting sun reflected off rows of buildings and ships docked along the harbor. Security gates opened onto a wide complex of roads and parking lots filled with officers, veterans, and their families. The ceremony was held inside a large hall near the waterfront. Flags lined the entrance. Inside, uniformed officers stood in small groups speaking quietly while retired veterans greeted each other with firm handshakes and easy laughter. There was a calm sense of respect in the room. Daniel introduced me to several colleagues, but I found my attention drifting toward the displays along the walls. Photographs of naval operations hung beside glass cases, filled with medals and historical artifacts. For the first time, I felt surrounded by people who understood the world my grandfather had once belonged to. Before leaving the house that evening, I had hesitated in front of the bedroom mirror. The medal rested in my palm. Without fully understanding why, I had threaded a thin chain through it and placed it around my neck. Now it hung quietly beneath my collar, not visible unless someone looked closely. The ceremony began with a series of speeches honoring different naval units, stories of deployments, rescue missions, and long careers filled the room as officers spoke from the podium. Families applauded politely. Veterans nodded with quiet pride. Daniel listened attentively beside me. But my attention kept wandering. I studied the photographs on the wall again. Helicopters lifting off from ships. Teams of soldiers moving through desert landscapes. Somewhere inside that history, my grandfather had lived a life I never fully understood. During a short break between speeches, people began moving around the hall again. Daniel stepped aside to speak with another officer, leaving me near one of the display tables. I leaned closer to examine a photograph of a Naval Special Operations unit standing beside a helicopter. That was when I felt someone watching me. I turned slightly. Across the room, an older officer had stopped walking. He wore the formal uniform of a Navy general. His posture was straight, his silver hair cut neatly above his collar. But what caught my attention wasn't his rank. It was the way he was staring at me. More specifically, at the medal around my neck. For several seconds, he didn't move. Then he began walking directly toward me. Something about the intensity in his expression made my chest tighten. By the time he reached us, Daniel had returned to my side. The officer stopped a few feet away and introduced himself calmly. "General Thomas Hale." Daniel immediately straightened. "Sir?" he said respectfully. But the general's attention never left the medal. He leaned slightly closer, studying it carefully. Then he asked a question in a quiet, controlled voice. "Where did you get that medal?" I hesitated. "It belonged to my grandfather," I said. What was his name? Walter Carter. For the first time, the general's expression changed. He blinked once, almost as if the name had struck him unexpectedly. Walter Carter, he repeated slowly. I nodded. My grandfather served in the Navy a long time ago. The general reached out carefully. May I see it? I lifted the chain over my head and placed the medal in his hand. He turned it slowly, examining the engraving along the edge. When his eyes reached the small sequence of letters and numbers, his entire posture stiffened. The room around us continued buzzing with conversation, but suddenly it felt distant. The general looked back up at me. His voice dropped lower. Did your family ever tell you what your grandfather did during the war? I shook my head. He never talked about it. The general stared at the medal again for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. If this medal really belonged to Walter Carter, he said quietly, then your grandfather was part of one of the most dangerous Navy SEAL missions our country has ever carried out. The general continued staring at the medal as if it carried the weight of an entire history. The crowded ceremony hall suddenly felt much quieter around us. Conversations continued in the distance, but they seemed far away, like background noise fading behind the moment unfolding in front of me. Daniel glanced between the general and me, clearly sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Is something wrong? Sir, he asked. General Hale didn't answer immediately. Instead, he ran his thumb gently along the engraving on the edge of the medal. His eyes moved carefully across the small symbols and the unit code stamped into the metal. Then he looked up again. You said your grandfather's name was Walter Carter. Yes, I said. For a moment he simply nodded. I thought so. He gestured toward a quieter corner of the room. Would you mind stepping over here with me? Daniel and I followed him away from the crowd until the voices from the ceremony softened into a distant murmur. When we stopped, the general turned the medal over one more time. This medal was issued to a very small group of operators, he said. Operators? I asked. Navy SEALs. The words hung in the air for a moment. I felt my pulse quicken. I suspected he might have been one, I said slowly. I once saw photographs of him with a SEAL team. General Hale nodded. This confirms it. He pointed gently to the small sequence of letters engraved along the rim of the medal. That code identifies a specific task group from a special operations unit. Daniel leaned slightly closer to examine it. What mission? He asked. The general's expression grew serious. A classified extraction operation overseas, he said. It took place decades ago during a conflict that most people barely remember now. I listened carefully as he continued. A group of American personnel became trapped behind enemy lines, he explained. Communication had broken down. Air support couldn't reach them. The situation was deteriorating quickly. The only option left was to send a small SEAL team deep into hostile territory to bring them out. It was an extremely dangerous mission. The general said, helicopters couldn't land safely near the target zone, so the team had to move through miles of rough terrain under constant threat of enemy patrols. According to the general, they reached the trapped soldiers after several days of careful movement through the area. But the real danger came during the extraction. The original evacuation point was compromised, he said. Enemy forces had discovered the route and were closing in. For a moment he paused, as if remembering the story in detail. That's when your grandfather made a decision that changed everything. My chest tightened. What did he do? The general looked directly at me. He led a small group away from the main team. The move created a diversion that pulled enemy forces away from the trapped soldiers and the remaining SEAL operators, while the rest of the team escorted the rescued personnel toward a secondary extraction point. My grandfather and the others moved in the opposite direction. They drew the attention of the enemy patrols. The general explained. The maneuver gave the rest of the group enough time to escape. Dozens of American soldiers were successfully evacuated. But the diversion team faced overwhelming pressure. They had to fight their way out alone, he said quietly. I felt a chill move through me. Did they make it out? The general nodded slowly. Barely. Several members of the team were injured during the escape. Some had to be carried for miles before helicopters could finally reach them. But they all survived, he added. The mission became one of the most respected rescue operations inside the SEAL community. I stared at the medal in his hand. If it was such an important mission, why didn't anyone ever talk about it? The general gave a faint, understanding smile. Because it stayed classified for years. Details of the operation were buried in military archives. The men involved returned home quietly and resumed their lives without public recognition. He handed the medal back to me. Many operators from that era preferred it that way. I remembered something my grandfather once said while we sat on his porch. Some things we survive, not everyone else does. General Hale continued. I remember hearing your grandfather's name when I was a young officer, he said. Senior commanders spoke about that mission during training discussions. They described the moment when the extraction route collapsed. Someone had to volunteer to create the diversion. Walter Carter stepped forward without hesitation. From what I was told, the general said, his decision saved dozens of lives. I stood there silently, trying to absorb the weight of what he had just told me. For years, my parents had described my grandfather as difficult, embarrassing, a problem. Yet inside the Navy SEAL community, he was remembered as the man who helped save an entire group of soldiers during one of their most dangerous missions. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. The general studied my face carefully. Does your family know any of this? He asked. I shook my head. They barely talked about him at all. Something dark passed briefly through the general's expression. If they knew who he really was, he said quietly, they would never have treated him that way. He glanced back toward the ceremony hall where officers and veterans continued speaking in small groups. Then he turned to me again. There are parts of that mission I can't discuss publicly here, he said. But if you're willing, I'd like to meet tomorrow and tell you more about your grandfather's legacy. I nodded slowly. As the general walked away, I looked down at the medal resting in my palm. For years it had been nothing more than a mystery. Now I realized something that made my breath catch. The quiet man my family had abandoned was remembered inside the Navy SEAL community as a legend. The next morning, the medal was still lying on the table between Daniel and me. Neither of us had slept much. The quiet cafe near the Norfolk waterfront was only half full, sunlight reflecting off the water outside the windows. I wrapped my hands around a cup of coffee that had already gone cold while Daniel looked again at the engraving on the medal. So your grandfather really was part of a SEAL rescue mission, he said quietly. I nodded. Hearing the story the night before had felt unreal. For years, the medal had been nothing more than a mysterious object in a drawer. Now it seemed to carry the weight of an entire hidden history. Daniel leaned back in his chair. If General Hale is right, he said, that kind of operation would have been extremely rare. He paused for a moment before adding something else. And extremely respected. The words stayed with me as we finished breakfast. Later that afternoon, we drove back onto the naval base to meet the general again. His office was in a quiet administrative building overlooking the harbor. Naval ships moved slowly across the water outside the window as he welcomed us inside. This time, the conversation felt more personal. General Hale placed a folder on the desk and opened it carefully. These documents were partially declassified a few years ago, he explained. Most of the mission details are still restricted, but enough information was released for historical documentation. Inside the folder were photographs, black and white images taken decades earlier. A team of Navy SEAL operators standing beside a helicopter. I leaned closer. My breath caught in my throat. My grandfather stood near the center of the group. He looked young, confident, completely different from the quiet man who used to sit on his porch watching fishing boats pass by. General Hale tapped the photograph gently. That's Walter Carter, he said. For a moment I simply stared at the image. Seeing him there among the team made everything feel real in a way the story alone hadn't. He never told anyone, I said quietly. That was common, the general replied. Men from those units rarely spoke about classified operations. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. The Navy recently began documenting the mission as part of its official historical archive. Because of that, the surviving members of the team will finally receive public recognition. I felt a wave of emotion rise unexpectedly. You mean there will be a ceremony? Yes, he said. A formal tribute to the operation and the men involved. For years, my grandfather had lived quietly, without recognition. Now the truth about what he had done was finally surfacing. But that truth didn't stay private for long. Within a few weeks, small articles began appearing in military publications and local newspapers. The story of the rescue mission slowly spread. One headline mentioned the role of a SEAL operator named Walter Carter. Soon after that, the phone calls from my parents started. The first one came late in the evening. My father's voice sounded strangely upbeat. "We saw the article about your grandfather," he said. It was the first time in years he had spoken about him. He served with distinction. My mother added quickly, "We always knew he had done important work." I closed my eyes for a moment. For years they had avoided even saying his name. Now suddenly they spoke about him like proud relatives. "He died alone," I said quietly. The line went silent. Neither of them responded immediately. A week later, the Navy organized a public tribute honoring the rescue mission. Daniel and I returned to the base for the ceremony. This time, the hall was even more crowded than before. Veterans filled the rows of chairs. Families stood along the walls. Several older men wearing SEAL insignia gathered near the front of the room. General Hale stepped to the podium. He began describing the rescue mission in careful detail, explaining the risks the team had faced and the lives that had been saved. Then he spoke my grandfather's name. "Walter Carter." The room responded instantly. Dozens of people rose to their feet. Applause filled the hall. For the first time in my life, I heard my grandfather's name spoken with respect and admiration by an entire room full of people. My chest tightened as I listened. Near the back of the hall, I noticed two familiar figures standing quietly. My parents. They had come after all. Their expressions were hard to read. Regret. Embarrassment. Something close to guilt. But in that moment, I realized something important. The recognition happening in that room wasn't about them. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about finally honoring a man who had never asked for attention. As the applause faded and people slowly took their seats again, I looked toward the stage where my grandfather's photograph appeared on a large screen behind the podium. For years I had believed my family had erased him. But standing there in that crowded hall, surrounded by veterans and soldiers who remembered the mission he helped lead, I understood the truth. The quiet man my parents abandoned had never really been forgotten. Not by the people who mattered most. The crowd slowly began to leave the auditorium after the ceremony ended. Conversations filled the room as veterans shook hands. Families took photographs, and officers exchanged quiet words of respect. The large screen at the front of the hall still displayed the photograph of the SEAL team from decades earlier. My grandfather stood among them, young and steady, the same man who used to sit silently on his porch watching the water. Daniel touched my arm gently. "You all right?" he asked. I nodded, though my chest still felt tight. For years, my grandfather had lived as a quiet old man most people overlooked. But in that room, surrounded by people who understood what he had done, his life finally felt seen. As the crowd continued to thin, an older man approached me. His hair was silver, his shoulders still broad despite the years. On his jacket was a small SEAL insignia. He stopped in front of me and extended his hand. "Michael Donnelly," he said. I shook his hand. "I served with Walter." The words sent a small shock through me. "You knew my grandfather?" He smiled faintly. "Knew him well." For a moment we simply stood there. Michael glanced toward the photograph still glowing on the screen. "That mission changed a lot of lives," he said quietly. I nodded. "General Hale told me some of it." Michael let out a slow breath. "He probably told you the official version." There was something different in his voice now. Something more personal. He was the calmest man on that team. Michael continued. "When things got bad, and they did, Walter never panicked." I listened carefully as he spoke. "When the extraction point collapsed, most of us thought we were done," he said. "Enemy patrols were closing in from 2 directions. Nobody knew how we were going to get everyone out." Then my grandfather stepped forward. "He didn't make a speech," Michael said. He just said he'd take a small group and draw attention away from the rest of us. I imagined that moment. The chaos. The pressure. My grandfather standing there quietly making a decision that would change everything. He knew exactly what he was doing. Michael said. He was giving the rest of us a chance. Michael paused for a moment, his eyes distant with memory. We made it out because of him. A quiet weight settled between us. Why didn't he ever tell anyone? I asked. Michael smiled gently. That wasn't who Walter was. He looked back at the photograph again. Most of us came home and tried to move on. But Walter, he carried the mission differently. How? He didn't want praise, Michael said. He just wanted to know the men we rescued got back to their families. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he squeezed my shoulder. You should be proud of him. After he left, Daniel and I stepped outside into the cool evening air. The harbor stretched quietly beyond the naval base. Lights from the ships reflected on the water like scattered stars. I held the medal in my hand again. For years I had believed my grandfather had lived and died without recognition. But that wasn't true. The people who mattered had always known. A few days later I drove back to Virginia. The cemetery looked different than it had on the day of the funeral. Small American flags lined several of the graves. Someone had placed a wreath beside my grandfather's headstone. Walter James Carter, United States Navy. I stood there for a long time, remembering the empty funeral room and the quiet salute from the stranger who had appeared that day. At the time, I thought my grandfather had been forgotten. Now I understood how wrong I had been. His teammates remembered. The Navy remembered. The men whose lives he helped save remembered. I placed the medal gently against the base of the headstone. For years it had been nothing more than a mystery. Now it felt like a symbol of something much larger. Not just courage, but quiet dignity. The kind that doesn't need recognition to exist. A soft breeze moved through the cemetery, rustling the small flags planted beside the graves. I sat down on the grass and looked at the name carved into the stone. You kept your secrets well, I said softly. But somehow I felt like he had trusted the truth to find its way out eventually. My parents called again later that week. Their voices sounded different now, quieter. They admitted they never really understood him, that they had been uncomfortable with parts of his life they couldn't control or explain. For the first time, they said they regretted how things had ended. Maybe that regret would take years to fully understand. But strangely, I didn't feel angry anymore, because the truth had already done what it needed to do. My grandfather didn't need their approval. He never had. As I drove away from the cemetery that afternoon, I thought about how many stories like his might still be hidden in quiet houses across the country. Men and women who carried extraordinary histories without ever speaking about them. Sometimes the strongest people in our lives are the ones we know the least about. And sometimes we don't discover their real story until it's too late to ask them ourselves. So I want to ask you something. Have you ever learned something surprising about someone in your family after they were gone? Maybe a grandparent? Maybe a parent? Maybe someone whose life held more courage than you ever realized. If you have a story like that, I would really love to hear it. Share it in the comments. Because stories like these deserve to be remembered. And if you enjoy real stories about family, hidden truths, and moments when the past finally reveals itself, stay with the channel and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones that almost disappeared. My grandfather lived most of his life as a quiet man people misunderstood. But every time I hold that medal now, I remember exactly who he truly was.